A racist pilot targets a black billionaire woman, forcing her off a plane in an incident that's as shocking as it is revealing. The woman, who had quietly booked a first-class seat, is humiliated and removed without cause. What the pilot didn't know: her father owns the airline. This eye-opening story exposes deep-seated issues of racism and discrimination in the aviation industry and reveals the incredible twist of fate that followed. Stay tuned as we dive into the full story, a tale of prejudice, resilience, and unexpected justice. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and share your thoughts. If you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change and uncover hidden truths. Amara Johnson moved through the airport terminal with the poise of a woman accustomed to commanding her world. She was tired. Yes, long days spent negotiating deals and solving problems had a way of wearing a person down, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place. Dressed sharply in a tailored cream suit, she looked every bit the part of a billionaire tech entrepreneur. Though she'd grown weary of the attention her success sometimes brought, she didn't have time for attention today. All she wanted was to sink into the comfort of her first-class seat, close her eyes, and let the miles slide away beneath her. The air inside the terminal hummed with the usual pre-flight chaos. Announcements echoed overhead, calling out boarding groups and gate changes. Families wrangled children, business travelers paced with phones pressed to their ears, and weary attendants checked tickets with practiced efficiency. Amara blended into the crowd, but she felt the subtle stares, the quick glances that lingered just a moment too long, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. These were stares she had known all her life. They carried questions that never needed to be spoken aloud. What's she doing here? Who does she think she is? The stares didn't wound her anymore, but they clung to her like cobwebs, impossible to brush away completely. She reached her gate and handed her boarding pass to the attendant, who barely glanced at it before looking up at her. The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if recalibrating her assumptions. Then came the voice Amara had come to recognize as a harbinger of trouble, polite, firm, and vaguely apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but there's been a mistake with your seat." Amara frowned, her exhaustion giving way to confusion. "What kind of mistake?" "The seat you've been assigned is unavailable. I'll need to reassign you to another seat." Amara glanced at her ticket and then at the attendant, keeping her voice even. "I booked this seat months ago. It's a first-class reservation. Is there some kind of problem?" The attendant shifted on her feet, avoiding Amara's gaze. "It's a mix-up with our records. I'll need to move you to another section of the plane." Amara's brow furrowed. "Another section? You mean coach?" The attendant's lips tightened. "I'm afraid that's all we have available." A quiet tension began to gather in the space between them, like storm clouds forming on a distant horizon. Amara felt her patience thinning but held onto her composure. She had dealt with situations like this before, too many times to count. Always, there was an explanation, some innocuous excuse that had nothing to do with race and everything to do with procedures or protocols. But the pattern was unmistakable, and it gnawed at her, a constant reminder of how the world could bend itself against her in the smallest, cruelest ways. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," she said. The attendant blinked, startled by the firmness in Amara's tone. "I'll see what I can do," she said, disappearing into the chaos of the terminal. Amara stood at the gate, clutching her boarding pass, aware of the eyes on her. A few passengers murmured among themselves, their gazes darting toward her and then away, like children caught peeking through a keyhole. She could feel their curiosity, their assumptions. What story were they telling themselves about her? Was she a problem, a disruption, or simply a woman who didn't know her place? Minutes passed before the supervisor arrived, a man in a crisp uniform with graying hair and a practiced air of authority. Captain Robert Hayes. His eyes swept over her like a searchlight, sharp and assessing, before landing on the boarding pass in her hand. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked. His voice clipped. "I was told there's been a mistake with my seat," Amara said, meeting his gaze evenly. "But as you can see, I have a confirmed first-class reservation." Hayes glanced at the pass, his expression unreadable. "That seat is no longer available." "Why not?" Amara asked, her voice calm but unyielding. Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, he squared his shoulders and said, "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to a different seat." Amara felt a flicker of disbelief. "With all due respect, Captain, I paid for this seat. And I have the ticket to prove it. I'm not moving." The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Hayes' jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened, not with anger but with something colder. Something harder to name. "You're holding up the boarding process," he said. "I need you to cooperate, or I'll have to involve security." It was a threat, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of procedure. Amara's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "This isn't about procedure, is it?" she said quietly. "This is about you deciding I don't belong here." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Hayes' face reddened, and for a moment, he looked as though he might say something. But instead, he turned sharply and motioned to a security officer standing nearby. "Escort this passenger off the plane," he said. The words fell like a stone into the hushed crowd. And for a moment, no one moved. Then the officer stepped forward, his hand hovering uncertainly near Amara's arm. She met his gaze, her voice steady but cold. "Don't touch me," she said. "I'll leave." The officer hesitated but nodded, stepping back as Amara gathered her things. She turned to the gate one last time, her eyes sweeping over the passengers who had watched the entire scene unfold. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them intervened. As she walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she felt a familiar anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. This wasn't new, and it wasn't surprising, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. She would fight this, not just for herself but for every person who had been told, in 1,000 small and cutting ways, that they didn't belong. And as she stepped into the terminal, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The name on the screen made her pause. Charles Johnson. "Daddy," she whispered to herself, answering the call. Something just happened. Amara Johnson sat in the airport lounge, her body tense but her face calm. The buzz of her phone in her lap was incessant. Friends, colleagues, even reporters who had somehow caught wind of what had just happened. She ignored it all, her eyes fixed on the tarmac beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The plane that had been hers only moments ago was preparing for departure. It sat gleaming in the late afternoon sun, a cruel reminder of the space she had been forced to leave. The humiliation stung, but it was the silence of the passengers that lingered like an open wound. Not one voice had spoken up. Not one had questioned the captain's decision. Their eyes had followed her, sure, but their mouths had stayed shut. It was a silence that spoke volumes of complicity, of fear, of the invisible weight of prejudice that hung over every moment of her life. Across the terminal, Captain Robert Hayes sat in the crew lounge, his expression dark. He had dismissed the incident as a matter of protocol, but the tightness in his chest refused to ease. He replayed the scene in his mind, the sharpness in her voice, the unwavering way she met his gaze. It had unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. She was making a scene, he muttered to himself, as though saying it aloud would make it true. But even as the words left his mouth, they rang hollow. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about the assumptions he carried with him, the unspoken hierarchy that dictated who belonged where. He told himself he was enforcing rules, but those rules always seemed to bend under the weight of his biases. The crew around him chatted lightly, oblivious to his inner turmoil. He considered confiding in someone but stopped himself. What could he say? That he'd made a mistake? That he hadn't expected a black woman to fight back so fiercely? No, he would say nothing. Silence, after all, had always been his shield. Back in the terminal, Amara answered the call from her father. Charles Johnson. His voice was steady, as it always was, but there was an edge of controlled anger beneath his words. "Tell me everything," he said, and she did every word, every gesture, every dismissive glance. As she spoke, she could hear him tapping his pen against his desk, a familiar rhythm that always accompanied his deepest thoughts. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, finally, he spoke. "They didn't see you, Amara," he said. "They saw their own assumptions, their own fears, and they acted on them. But you don't have to accept that." "I know," she said softly, "but it's exhausting, Daddy, fighting this over and over. Why should I have to keep proving I belong?" "Because if you don't," he said, his voice firm, "they win, and we've come too far to let them win." As Amara ended the call, she felt a flicker of resolve reignite. She had fought too hard to let this moment define her. But even as she steadied herself, The weight of what had happened pressed down on her. It wasn't just about her, it was about the system that had allowed this to happen. The unspoken rules that determined who was worthy and who was not. She decided to head to the airline's customer service desk to file a formal complaint. The agent behind the counter was young, her polished smile faltering slightly as Amara approached. "How can I help you?" the agent asked, her tone professional but hesitant. Amara explained the situation, detailing the captain's actions and the blatant disregard for her reservation. As she spoke, she saw the discomfort creep into the agent's face. A flicker of recognition that this was not an ordinary complaint. "I'll need to escalate this to a manager," the agent said, her voice shaky. "Please wait here." Amara nodded, but as she stood there, the murmur of nearby passengers reached her ears. She must have done something. One man whispered to his companion, "They don't just remove people for no reason." "I don't know," the woman replied. "First class? She doesn't look like the type." Amara turned slowly, her eyes locking onto theirs. They froze, caught in the act of reducing her existence to a stereotype. She didn't say a word she didn't have to. The weight of her gaze was enough to send them scurrying away, their whispers trailing behind them. When the manager finally arrived, his demeanor was polite but dismissive. "We're very sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Johnson," he said, offering a canned apology that did nothing to address the heart of the issue. "We'll investigate the matter and get back to you." "That's not good enough," Amara said, her voice steady. "Your captain physically removed me from a seat I paid for, in front of a plane full of passengers. I want accountability, not excuses." The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll do our best," he said, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was hoping she would let it go. Hoping her anger would subside into silence like so many others before her. But Amara had no intention of letting it go. Not this time. As she walked away from the counter, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her assistant, forwarding an email from a journalist who had caught wind of the story. The subject line read, "Racial discrimination in the skies. A billionaire's fight for justice." Amara sighed. She hadn't wanted attention, she had only wanted her seat. But the attention was here now. And she realized she had a choice to make. She could stay silent, retreat into the safety of her privilege. Or she could stand up and force the world to confront its own ugliness. She stared at the subject line for a long moment before typing a reply. "Let's talk." The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the airport as Amara Johnson sat in the back of a sleek black car heading into the city. Her assistant had forwarded more emails than she could read, most from journalists eager to turn her ordeal into the story of the day. Social media was already ablaze, the hashtags multiplying by the hour. Hashtag justice for Amara. Hashtag no seat for racism. Hashtag flying while black. Amara's thumb hovered over her phone screen, indecision prickling at the edge of her resolve. She had always avoided public spectacles. But this wasn't just about her anymore. The weight of what had happened sat heavy in her chest, like an anchor pulling her down even as her anger urged her forward. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You don't have to accept this. But you do have to face it." She exhaled and replied to one of the emails. "Yes, I'm ready to talk." The article hit the news before Amara even reached her apartment. The journalist had worked fast, and her story was now a headline on major platforms. Tech billionaire Amara Johnson removed from first-class seat by airline captain in racially charged incident. The piece was scathing, laying bare the details of her experience alongside broader statistics about racial discrimination in the airline industry. It was well written, precise, and unflinching, but as Amara scrolled through the comments section, her stomach churned. "She's just playing the race card." One commenter wrote, "Billionaire victim? Spare me," said another. And then the one that stung the most, "If she didn't act entitled, maybe she wouldn't have been removed." Amara put her phone down, her hands trembling. The bile rising in her throat wasn't from the words themselves, she had heard it all before, but from the exhausting, predictable way the narrative was shifting. Even with her wealth, her accomplishments, her undeniable proof, people were ready to dismiss her pain as a performance. Meanwhile, across town, Captain Robert Hayes sat in a cramped office at the airline's headquarters. His supervisor had called him in for a meeting after the article broke. Hayes was a man used to control, and the chaos of the last few hours had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "This is serious, Robert," said Evelyn Carter, the airline's CEO. Her tone sharp. She sat across from him, a tablet in hand, her expression hard. "This story is everywhere. It's not just about you. It's about the airline, and it's a PR disaster." Hayes shifted in his chair. "I was following protocol," he said defensively. She was being disruptive. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Disruptive? She was sitting in her assigned seat. "Robert, first class, which she paid for. Explain to me how that's disruptive." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The justification he had clung to earlier now felt flimsy under her scrutiny. "This isn't just a bad look for us," Evelyn continued. "This is systemic. People are angry, and they should be. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, but it's the first time it's gone public in such a big way. You may have thought you were enforcing rules, but what you were really doing was reinforcing bias." Her words landed like punches, and Hayes felt his defenses crumbling. He had always seen himself as a fair man, a professional, but now, confronted with the evidence of his own actions, he was beginning to see the cracks in his self-image. Amara didn't sleep that night. The flood of emails and messages showed no sign of slowing, and every new notification brought another wave of frustration. But the moments that haunted her most weren't online, they were from the plane. The passengers who averted their eyes. The ones who whispered and judged. The silence that had suffocated her. She thought of one woman in particular. Sitting in the row ahead. The woman had looked back at Amara as she was being led off the plane. Her expression a mix of sympathy and fear. Fear of what? Speaking up? Being wrong? Or was it simply the fear of being noticed at all? The thought made Amara's chest tighten. Racism wasn't always loud. It wasn't always a slur or a shove. Sometimes it was just the quiet choice to do nothing. To look away. To let the world keep turning on its crooked axis. The next morning, Amara decided to take action. She contacted her legal team, determined to file a formal complaint against the airline and Captain Hayes. But as she sat in her lawyer's office, reviewing the details of her case, she realized how much was stacked against her. "They'll argue that he acted within his authority as captain," her lawyer, Lisa Morgan, explained, "and they'll try to paint you as combative or difficult. That's how these cases always go." Amara nodded, her jaw set. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." Lisa studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good, because this won't be easy. But it's necessary." As they prepared their strategy, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been told, in subtle or blatant ways, that they didn't belong. Across the city, Captain Hayes sat alone in his apartment, staring at the article on his laptop. The comments were vicious, and many of them were directed at him. Some defended his actions, but others called him out for exactly what they were: a reflection of a system that protected power and punished difference. For the first time in years, Hayes felt doubt creeping into his mind. He had prided himself on being a man of integrity, but the events of the past 2 days had forced him to confront a question he had never wanted to ask himself: am I part of the problem? The thought unsettled him, and yet, deep down, he knew the answer. The morning air hung heavy as Amara Johnson stepped into the courtroom. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but the relentless tide of silence and complicity had left her no other choice. Her name, her story, had become more than a headline. It was now a movement. And movements, she knew, demanded sacrifice. Her father, Charles, walked beside her, a steady presence in a world that had always tried to make her feel unmoored. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed a storm of emotion: pride, anger, fear. They both understood the stakes. This wasn't just about a seat or a single flight. It was about every door slammed shut, every promotion withheld, every unspoken rule that told people like them they didn't belong. Captain Robert Hayes sat at the defendant's table, his once crisp uniform replaced by a simple suit that hung loosely on his frame. The confidence he had carried like armor was gone, stripped away by days of public scrutiny and sleepless nights. He avoided looking at Amara, but her presence was impossible to ignore. She was poised, unyielding, a living rebuke to every justification he had whispered to himself. The courtroom filled with murmurs as spectators took their seats. Some were there out of curiosity, others for solidarity, and still others with expressions that suggested they were rooting for Hayes. It was a divided room. reflective of the fault lines running through the country itself. The first witnesses were called. Passengers from the flight who had seen the incident unfold. Some spoke hesitantly, their voices tinged with guilt as they admitted they had done nothing to intervene. One man, middle-aged and nervous, stammered as he recounted the moment Hayes ordered Amara off the plane. She wasn't doing anything wrong, he said, his gaze darting between Amara and Hayes. She was just sitting there, like anyone else. The prosecutor pressed him. And yet, you didn't speak up. Why? The man fidgeted, his discomfort palpable. I didn't want to get involved, he said finally. I didn't think it was my place. Amara's lawyer, Lisa Morgan, leaned forward. But it was your place to watch, she said, her voice calm but cutting. It was your place to let it happen. The man flinched but said nothing. Hayes' defense lawyer, Richard Calloway, attempted to shift the narrative. He painted Hayes as a seasoned professional, a man tasked with maintaining order in a high-pressure environment. Captain Hayes acted within his authority. Calloway argued, his tone measured. This was not about race. It was about ensuring the safety and comfort of all passengers. But Amara's team was ready. Lisa presented surveillance footage showing Hayes shoving Amara out of her seat. His expression hard, his words dripping with condescension. The video played in stark silence. The room gripped by the undeniable reality of what had happened. As the trial continued, the layers of systemic prejudice became impossible to ignore. Experts testified about the pervasive biases in the airline industry, from hiring practices to seating assignments. One researcher detailed a study showing that black passengers were disproportionately subjected to additional security screenings and were more likely to be denied upgrades or preferred seating. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the testimony continued. It was no longer just about him, it was about a system he had upheld. Perhaps without even realizing it. During a break, Amara sat alone in a quiet corner of the courthouse. Her phone buzzed with messages of support. But she didn't read them. Instead, her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the stories her father had told her about his own battles against prejudice. He had fought to make a space for himself in a world that tried to erase him. And now she was doing the same. Charles found her and sat beside her. You're doing well, he said quietly. I don't feel like I am, she admitted. I feel exposed. Charles nodded. That's what they want, to make you feel small. But you're not, and they know it. She looked at him, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. It's not just about me, she said. It's about all of us. Charles smiled, his pride evident. Then make them see that. As the trial resumed, Amara took the stand. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I wasn't removed from that seat because I was disruptive, she said. I was removed because someone decided I didn't belong. And that decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It was made in a world that has told people like me, over and over, that no matter how hard we work, no matter how much we achieve, we will never be enough. Her words hung in the air, a stark indictment of the unspoken rules that governed not just the airline, but the world. Hayes stared at the table in front of him, his face pale. For the first time, he seemed to truly understand the gravity of what he had done. Amara Johnson felt the courtroom shift as she stepped down from the witness stand. The silence following her testimony was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, wrapping itself around every person in the room. Her words had been deliberate, her tone measured, but the raw truth of her experience had cut through the air like a scalpel. She returned to her seat beside her lawyer, Lisa Morgan, and met her father's gaze across the room. Charles Johnson offered a small nod of approval, his expression proud but guarded. Amara had grown up watching him navigate boardrooms filled with men who underestimated him, dismissing his intelligence and tenacity. He had taught her to stand tall in the face of doubt. But even he couldn't shield her from the weight of this fight. On the other side of the courtroom, Captain Robert Hayes sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together. He couldn't bring himself to look at Amara. Instead, he stared at the polished wood of the defendant's table, as though the grain might reveal a path out of the mess he had created. His lawyer, Richard Calloway, leaned in close, speaking in a low voice. We're going to redirect the focus, Calloway said. Emphasize the procedural aspects. This isn't about race, it's about maintaining order. Hayes nodded stiffly, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just about procedure. The echoes of Amara's testimony haunted him, forcing him to confront questions he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Why had he really asked her to move? Why had he assumed she was in the wrong? The answers, buried beneath years of rationalizations, were beginning to surface, and they terrified him. The prosecution called their next witness, a sociologist named Dr. Evelyn Harper. She was an older black woman with sharp eyes and a voice that commanded attention. She took the stand and began explaining the concept of implicit bias, weaving a tapestry of data and anecdotes that laid bare the ways racism operated in everyday life. "This isn't about overt hatred," she said, her voice firm. "It's about the small, quiet decisions we make without even realizing it. Who we trust, who we believe, who we think belongs." She turned to the jury, her gaze piercing. When Captain Hayes saw Ms. Johnson sitting in that seat, he didn't see a successful entrepreneur. He saw someone who didn't fit his idea of who should be in first class. And that assumption, whether conscious or not, is what led to this moment. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dr. Harper's words felt like they were directed at him, peeling away the layers of his carefully constructed self-image. He wanted to object, to defend himself, but he knew the words wouldn't come. Outside the courthouse, the world was watching. Protesters had gathered, their voices rising in chants that carried into the building. Signs demanding justice for Amara dotted the crowd, alongside others calling for broader accountability within the airline industry. Amara could hear the noise as she stepped out during a recess. The support was heartening, but it also reminded her of the stakes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a system that had marginalized people like her for generations. She spotted a familiar face in the crowd: Angela Martinez, one of her first employees and now a close friend. Angela raised a fist in solidarity, and Amara felt a surge of gratitude. She wasn't alone in this fight. Back in the courtroom, the defense began their cross-examination of Dr. Harper. Calloway's tone was calm but insidious, his questions designed to sow doubt. "Dr. Harper, wouldn't you agree that bias is a two-way street?" he asked. "That individuals can sometimes misinterpret actions as discriminatory when, in fact, they're not?" Dr. Harper didn't flinch. "Bias can exist on all sides," she said, "but the question isn't whether bias exists. It's who bears the consequences of it." In this case, Ms. Johnson was removed from her seat, humiliated, and treated as though she didn't belong. "That's not an interpretation. That's a fact." Calloway pressed on, but the momentum had shifted. The prosecution's case was building, piece by piece, into an undeniable indictment of both Hayes and the system he represented. During the lunch recess, Hayes found himself alone in the hallway, pacing back and forth. The tension in his chest was unbearable, a knot of guilt and fear that refused to loosen. He thought of his father, a stern man who had taught him to value discipline and authority above all else. "You don't let people push you around," his father used to say. "You don't question yourself. You do what needs to be done." Hayes had lived by those words, but now they felt like chains. He realized, with a pang of regret, that he had never questioned whose authority he was enforcing or at whose expense. Amara sat with Lisa and Charles, reviewing notes for the next day's testimony. Lisa's confidence was infectious, but Amara couldn't shake the weight of what lay ahead. "They're going to come after me," she said quietly. "They'll try to paint me as angry or entitled." Lisa nodded. "They'll try, but we have the truth on our side. And the truth matters." Amara wasn't so sure. She had spent her life navigating a world where truth was often drowned out by perception. But as she looked at her father, at Lisa, and at the protesters outside, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time, the truth would be enough. The courtroom had taken on the air of a theater. Each witness and testimony another act in a drama that was no longer just about Amara Johnson or Captain Robert Hayes. It had become a story about a country's soul, about the unspoken rules that dictated whose voices were heard and whose humanity was recognized. Amara sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, but beneath her calm exterior, she felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She knew what they saw: a black woman who refused to bow, whose very existence challenged the idea of who belonged in first class. In boardrooms, in the pages of history. But the trial was far from over, and the defense was ready to strike. Richard Calloway, Hayes' lawyer, rose with a deliberate slowness, his every movement calculated. He approached the jury with the confidence of a man who believed he could reshape the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, "let's not lose sight of the facts. This case isn't about systemic issues or grand statements on society. It's about a misunderstanding, a moment of human error." He turned toward Amara, his gaze softening in a way that felt rehearsed. "Ms. Johnson is an accomplished woman. No one here is denying her success or her right to be treated with respect. But is it possible, just possible, that this situation has been misinterpreted?" Amara's lawyer, Lisa Morgan, stiffened but remained silent, waiting for her moment. Calloway continued, addressing the jury. "Captain Hayes was enforcing standard protocol. He made a decision in the interest of the passengers' safety and comfort. To suggest that this decision was motivated by bias is speculative at best." Amara clenched her fists beneath the table. The narrative was shifting, as she knew it would. Her anger, her refusal to be silenced, was being reframed as overreaction. The subtle twist of perspective was insidious, a reminder of how easily truth could be reshaped to protect those in power. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "No room for racism in the skies." Across the street, a smaller group held signs that said, "Support our pilots," and "Stop playing the race card." The tension was palpable, a physical manifestation of the country's fractures. Reporters moved between the groups, microphones outstretched, amplifying the cacophony of opinions. Amara's father, Charles, stood near the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. He felt the familiar ache of a battle he had fought for decades, a battle that seemed to shift but never truly end. His daughter was at the center of it now, and while he admired her strength, he hated the toll it was taking on her. Back inside, Lisa began her rebuttal. She stood with a calm that belied the fire in her voice. "Misinterpreted?" she said, her tone sharp. "Let's look at the facts." Ms. Johnson was sitting in her assigned seat. She had a valid first-class ticket. And yet, Captain Hayes chose to remove her forcefully without justification. If this was a misunderstanding, then why was Ms. Johnson the only one targeted? Why was she treated as though she didn't belong? She turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. "This isn't about a single decision. It's about a pattern that reflects the quiet, pervasive bias that people of color face every day. It's about a system that allows someone like Captain Hayes to act on those biases without accountability." Her words resonated, and for a moment, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. During a recess, Hayes sat alone in a quiet corner of the courthouse. His head was in his hands, his thoughts a tangle of defensiveness and doubt. The image he had of himself, an impartial enforcer of rules, a man who simply did his job, was crumbling under the weight of the evidence. He thought of his daughter, a college freshman studying sociology. She had sent him a text the night before. "Dad, have you ever thought about how your decisions affect people? Like, really thought about it?" He hadn't replied. He didn't know how to explain the knot of fear and regret growing inside him. As the trial resumed, Lisa called her final witness, a former flight attendant who had worked under Hayes. The woman, a white woman in her 40s named Margaret, hesitated as she took the stand, her nervousness evident. "Ms. Dawson," Lisa began, "can you describe Captain Hayes' behavior toward passengers during your time working with him?" Margaret swallowed hard. "He was strict," she said carefully. "He liked to keep things in order." Lisa nodded. "And did you ever notice any differences in how he treated passengers based on their appearance?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at Hayes. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, he seemed quicker to assume the worst about certain passengers. Especially black passengers." The courtroom murmured, and Hayes' face turned ashen. Lisa pressed further. "Can you give us an example?" Margaret nodded reluctantly. "There was a time when a black man in first class asked for a drink refill. Captain Hayes told me to ignore him. Said he was probably trying to get more than he paid for." The room erupted in whispers, and the judge called for order. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected this, a crack in Hayes' facade. Evidence that his actions weren't just a one-time lapse in judgment. As the day ended, the courtroom emptied, but the tension lingered. Hayes left through a side door, avoiding the protesters and reporters waiting outside. He felt hollow, the foundation of his beliefs eroded by the testimony he had heard. Amara walked out with her father. The noise of the crowd washing over them. She felt a surge of energy from their chants. But also a deep exhaustion. The fight was far from over. And the next steps would be even harder. Charles put a hand on her shoulder. "You're making them see, Amara," he said. "That's the first step, but it's not the last." She nodded, her resolve firm. "I won't stop until they do." The courtroom was alive with tension. The air electric with the weight of unspoken truths. Each new piece of testimony, each legal maneuver, had brought the trial to this moment, a reckoning that no one could avoid. For Amara Johnson, it was no longer just a fight for justice, it was a fight to expose the quiet, insidious forces that had shaped her life and the lives of so many others. For Captain Robert Hayes, it was a battle with himself as much as with the court. The carefully constructed world of order and authority he had lived in was crumbling under the scrutiny of his own actions. He was beginning to understand that the story he told himself about who he was might not survive the light of truth. The day began with the defense calling Hayes to the stand. He moved with a stiffness that betrayed his inner turmoil. As he took his oath, the eyes of the courtroom bore down on him, each gaze a mirror reflecting the doubts he was too afraid to confront. Calloway approached him with a reassuring smile. But Hayes barely noticed. His mind was already spiraling, replaying every decision he had made on that flight. He had told himself that enforcing the rules was his duty. But he could no longer deny the part of him that had judged Amara before she even spoke. "Captain Hayes," Calloway began, his tone gentle, "can you describe your decision-making process on the day in question?" Hayes cleared his throat. "I was focused on maintaining order," he said, his voice flat. "When Ms. Johnson refused to comply, I made the decision to remove her for the sake of the other passengers." "And was this decision influenced by her race?" Calloway asked. Hayes hesitated, the pause stretching into an eternity. "No," he said finally, though the word felt like sand in his mouth. "It wasn't about race." Lisa Morgan rose for the cross-examination. Her movements deliberate, she approached Hayes with the precision of a surgeon. Each question designed to peel back another layer of his defenses. "Captain Hayes," she began, her voice calm but firm. "You've stated that your decision to remove Ms. Johnson wasn't about race. Is that correct?" "Yes," Hayes replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa nodded. "Let's talk about assumptions. Then, when you saw Ms. Johnson sitting in her assigned seat, what did you assume about her?" "I didn't assume anything," Hayes said quickly. Too quickly. Lisa arched an eyebrow. "You didn't assume she was in the wrong? That she didn't belong in first class?" Hayes shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. I was just following protocol." Lisa pressed on. "And yet, you didn't ask any other passengers to move. You didn't question anyone else's right to be in first class. Why is that?" The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His own actions had become a trap he couldn't escape. As the court adjourned for a recess, Amara stepped outside into the sunlight. The crowd had grown larger, their chants louder. She felt a wave of gratitude for their support, but also a deep exhaustion. This fight had taken everything she had, and there was still so much more to do. Charles joined her, his presence steady as always. "You're making them see," he said quietly, "but it's not easy to look in the mirror." Amara nodded, her gaze fixed on the crowd. "I just want them to understand," she said, "not just him, but everyone. I want them to see how deep this runs." Charles placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're showing them, one step at a time." Inside, Hayes sat in a small conference room with Calloway. The lawyer was speaking, but Hayes wasn't listening. His mind was caught on the question Lisa had asked him. "Why didn't you question anyone else?" He thought of the other passengers on the flight, their faces blending into a blur of indifference. He had focused on Amara because she stood out, because her presence in first class had disrupted the quiet assumptions he carried without even realizing it. Hayes' thoughts were interrupted by Calloway's voice. "Robert, we can still salvage this. You need to stay firm." But Hayes wasn't sure he could. The cracks in his certainty had widened into chasms, and he was beginning to see himself in a way he never had before. The afternoon session brought a new level of intensity as Lisa called Amara back to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about one flight," Amara said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is about a lifetime of being told, in ways big and small, That I don't belong. That no matter how hard I work, how much I achieve, there will always be someone ready to question my worth." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Captain Hayes didn't just see a passenger in first class. He saw a challenge to his assumptions. And he acted on those assumptions without ever questioning them. Hayes felt her words like a blow to the chest. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. As the session ended, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. The trial was nearing its conclusion. But the larger questions it had raised remained unanswered. Could a single verdict change a system so deeply rooted in bias? Could one woman's fight force a society to confront its own failings? Amara didn't have those answers. But she knew she had to keep pushing. For herself, for her father, for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible. As she walked out of the courthouse that evening, the chants of the crowd followed her, a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. And inside, Captain Hayes sat alone, the weight of his own reflection pressing down on him. For the first time, he began to understand the cost of his silence, the damage wrought by his unexamined beliefs. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the final day, the air thick with anticipation. Every seat was taken, and the crowd spilled into the hallways outside. Reporters whispered updates into their microphones. Protesters pressed against barriers outside, and the buzz of tension was almost tangible. Amara Johnson sat beside her lawyer, Lisa Morgan, her posture unyielding. She wore a quiet confidence now not born of certainty in the verdict, but of the knowledge that she had fought with all the dignity and resilience she possessed. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made invisible. Across the aisle, Captain Robert Hayes sat pale and withdrawn, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The man who had once walked with the confidence of authority now looked like a shadow of himself. He stared straight ahead, his thoughts a torrent of regret and shame. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience reading the complexities of human nature, entered the room. The murmurs ceased, and silence fell over the courtroom. "We are here to deliver the verdict," Judge Eleanor Monroe said, her voice steady. "This case has been a difficult one, touching on issues that go far beyond the actions of the defendant. It has forced us to confront questions about bias, justice, and the ways we treat one another." The jury foreman rose, holding a sheet of paper. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but subdued. "In the case of Ms. Amara Johnson versus Captain Robert Hayes, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of racial discrimination and misconduct." A collective exhale swept through the room. Amara closed her eyes, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy but necessary burden. Charles, sitting a few rows behind her, reached out to place a steadying hand on her shoulder. The judge continued, her tone measured. "This court finds that Captain Hayes' actions reflect a pattern of implicit bias and abuse of authority, exacerbated by systemic failures within the airline industry. The defendant is hereby ordered to undergo mandatory training on racial bias and inclusion. Additionally, the airline will face a comprehensive review of its policies and practices, with mandated reforms to ensure accountability." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. This case is not just about one individual, but about the broader systems that allow such biases to persist. We must do better. As the courtroom emptied, Hayes remained seated, his head bowed. Amara glanced at him, her emotions a mix of vindication and exhaustion. She didn't hate him. What she hated was the system that had shaped him and the one that had forced her to fight this battle in the first place. Outside, the crowd erupted. Supporters cheered, their signs waving high. Amara stepped out into the sunlight, her father by her side. Reporters surged forward, their questions a chaotic blur. "What's next for you, Ms. Johnson? Do you feel justice was served?" Amara raised her hand, and the crowd quieted. "This is not the end," she said, her voice clear. "This is just the beginning. This fight was never just about me. It was about the systems that divide us, that diminish our humanity. And those systems don't change overnight. But today, we took a step forward. And tomorrow, we'll take another." The days that followed were a whirlwind. Amara's victory sparked a national conversation, and her story became a catalyst for change. Airlines across the country began implementing new policies, from implicit bias training to more transparent grievance procedures. But for Amara, The work wasn't done. She used her platform to launch an initiative aimed at addressing systemic racism in industries far beyond aviation. She spoke at conferences, met with lawmakers, and partnered with organizations fighting for equity and justice. Hayes, too, began a journey of reckoning. His suspension from the airline forced him to confront the realities he had long ignored. He attended the mandated training sessions, though at first begrudgingly, but as he listened to the stories of others who had experienced bias, something began to shift within him. One day, he reached out to Amara through a carefully worded letter. "I cannot undo what I did," he wrote, "but I want to do better. If there is any way I can support the work you're doing, I'm ready to listen." Amara read the letter in her office, her expression unreadable. She didn't know if she believed Hayes' sincerity, but she knew that change, if it came, would start with moments like these small, hesitant steps toward understanding. Months later, Amara stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium. Her father sat in the front row, his pride evident. Behind her was a screen displaying the logo of her new initiative. "Equity in Motion. This isn't about blame," she said, her voice steady. "It's about accountability. It's about recognizing the ways we've been shaped by the systems we live in and choosing to do better. We can't rewrite the past, but we can shape the future. And the future starts now." The audience rose to their feet, their applause filling the room. But Amara didn't hear it. Her thoughts were on the long road ahead, the battles still to be fought, and the belief that even the smallest steps could lead to monumental change.